Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we build commander decks without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazzet, and today we'll be brewing a budget build featuring the Madman turned Mad God from Final Fantasy VI, Kefka Court Mage. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content. And if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks for any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commander won last week's poll, and which ones you'll be voting for next to have a build of their own. Now, with all that shilling out of the way, let's kick off this deck tech by taking a deeper look at its commander and how we're going to be building around them. Kefka Court Mage is a dual-faced card whose front face is a 4/5 human wizard that costs 2 in Grixis that has the following abilities. Firstly, whenever he enters or attacks, each player discards a card, and then we draw a card for each type of card discarded that way. And secondly, we may pay 8/2 at sorcery speed, have each opponent sacrifice a permanent of their choice, and then transform Kefka Court Mage into Kefka Ruler of Ruin, a 5/7 avatar wizard with flying that, whenever an opponent loses life on our turn, has us draw that many cards. Looking at the strengths Kefka brings to the table, first and foremost is his ability to repeatedly rip cards out of our opponent's hands while generating us card advantage on ETB and attack, easily allowing us to at least break even after the discard while denying our opponent's resources, but more often than not netting us 2 to 3 cards so long as our opponents have cards left to pitch. And while it is true that he does force us to discard as well, seeing as Grixis has a lot of ways to generate value from the bin, this often ends up being more of a benefit than a liability if properly built around. Then, when we take a look at his back face, not only does he turn himself into an AoE edict upon transformation for added board disruption, but also lets us, at base, draw 5 cards a turn so long as at least one of our opponents can't block flyers, allowing him to continue generating card advantage for us even if all our opponents are hellbent for even more value. That said, Kefka's value generation doesn't come without its downsides, with his backface's draw being mandatory and easily capable of overdrawing us or even decking us out if we're inflicting too much damage into our opponents on our turn, making it something that either needs to be used sparingly or at least be reined in some capacity to avoid doing so, while his front face's discard and draw, which is more or less guaranteed as he enters, becomes a lot harder to safely reproc on subsequent turns due to his middling stats and lack of built-in evasion, which when combined with his higher than average CMC making it more difficult to recast him if we continue to crash him against blockers, means it may be in our best interest to find alternative ways for him to proc his effect by either allowing him to crack in safely or by avoiding having him attack altogether. Now, taking into consideration both the high amount of value and hand disruption our commander brings to the table, along with his limited capacity to get extra uses out of it by simply attacking, I opted to take this build in a flicker-focused direction, as being able to blink Kefka in and out of play ends up fixing almost all of his shortcomings, allowing us to swing in with him to proc his effect and then simply remove him from combat by exiling him, which not only keeps him alive but also procs his effect a second time for even more discard and draw, giving us the ability to untransform Kefka since dual-faced cards come back into play on their front face, allowing us to more safely use the draw his back face provides without being locked into it, and simply letting us keep him alive for longer against any removal our opponents throw his way to try and keep him from stripping their hands away. Then, to take further advantage of all the reliable discard Kefka will be forcing upon the table, we'll be running a suite of discard support to more quickly reduce our opponent's hands to nothing while generating value for ourselves, and punishing them for having no cards in hand, graveyard support pieces that will let us make use of the cards we and our opponents send to the bin for even more value, and, to further take advantage of our flicker effects once our opponents are out of cards in hand, even more ETB-centric creatures to help us remove any resources our opponents were able to stick to the board before we were able to take them from them, leaving us with a ruthlessly mean deck that will strip everything away from our opponents, starving them of resources while we continue to build value until they finally succumb. So let us dive back into the world of Final Fantasy VI and delve into the mind of its deranged antagonist, Kefka Palazzo. Being the first of Cid's Magitech Knight experiments for the Gestalian Empire, the process granted him considerable magical power, but, as it had not yet been perfected, it also drove him completely and utterly insane. And yet, despite his madness, his unparalleled magical prowess, and utter ruthlessness against the Empire's enemies soon caught the attention of Emperor Gastal himself, who appointed Kefka as his court mage and entrusted him with the Empire's most important missions. This was, of course, until he ultimately killed the Emperor when he unleashed the power of the Warring Triad upon the world, their unchecked magic causing a chaotic cataclysm that reshaped the face of the planet and ascending Kefka to godhood. Now he sits atop his tower built on the wreckage of the former Gestalian capital, the mad god of a shattered world, his maniacal laughter a grim reminder to those that survived the cataclysm as to who they now were forced to serve. So, now that we know a bit more about our commander and the game plan for this deck, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the pieces we'll be using to reliably proc our commander. Starting off with a suite of flash speed flicker sources we'll be using to get extra uses out of Kefka's ETB discard and draw on both our and our opponent's turns, as well as to dodge removal with and untransform Kefka if we need to. We have Essence Flux as our most cost-effective flash speed flicker source, able to do so at the cost of only a single mana. Siren's Ruse, Planar Incision, and Blur as slightly more expensive options that are still worth running to reproc and protect Kefka, with the latter two providing additional upside in the form of either a +1/+1 counter to make Kefka's subsequent attacks harder to block effectively, or by being a cantrip to help us dig for additional resources. Ghostly Flicker and Displace as 2-for-1 creature blinking to make up for their higher cost, allowing us to get an extra use out of another ETB creature, and the former alternatively letting us blink artifacts and lands to potentially generate us additional ramp and or help keep our back row intact. And lastly, Teferi's Time Twist, which doesn't return the target from exile until the next end step, making it harder to get immediate value, but making up for it by allowing Kefka to dodge wipes and having him come back permanently stronger to boot. And then as an instant speed flicker source that we need to get into play first, we have Deadeye Navigator, whose CMC6 body is mana intensive, although we do have a handful of ways to cheat it out for cheaper. But once it does come down, we can soul bond it to another creature in order to blink that creature or itself for 2 mana a pop, potentially allowing multiple flickers per turn so long as we have the mana to pay for it, and allowing us to change soul bond targets whenever a new creature or it enter or re-enter play to take advantage of our wide array of ETB effects. And rounding out our flicker package with a pair of entrants that can passively and repeatedly bring our creatures in and out of play each rotation, we'll be slotting in the classic Conjurer's Closet, which provides a once per turn flicker on our end step to get 1 extra proc off of Kefka or any of our other ETB-centric creatures for added value and or disruption, along with the new Y'shtola rule, who instead gives us 2 extra end step flickers on our turn for double the value thanks to granting us an additional end step, which consequently our previous entry can make use of as well if they're both in play at the same time for even more end of turn blinking. And finally, as a flicker payoff that can generate us even more value as our creatures leave and re-enter play, we have Dour Port Mage, which turns every creature we flicker into a cantrip for added card advantage, and, in a pinch, lets us bounce one of our creatures back to hand at instant speed if we don't have a flicker spell on hand to keep them alive, or simply don't mind hard casting them to get an extra use out of their ETB effect. So, now that we've gone over all the ways we'll be getting Kefka to leave and re-enter the battlefield, let's move on to the discard support pieces we'll be running to supplement and generate value off of his. Opening with some legendary sources of discard that are capable of ripping cards out of all our opponent's hands simultaneously while providing us with additional upside, the first half will see us run the massive Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger, who we can play early as a one-time source of discard and then again from our bin via its escape as a repeatable AoE discard and AoE burn source as it comes down and swings in, which we can easily set up with our self-discard sources, along with the much smaller Tiny Bones Bauble Burglar, who who we can tap for 4 at sorcery speed to have each opponent discard, which admittedly is a decently large mana investment, but offers upside by letting us exile and play any cards that are discarded by our opponents while he's in play to let us generate pseudo card advantage off of them, while simultaneously denying them graveyard value. And keep in mind that due to him exiling these cards with stash counters, and his passive letting us cast any spells in exile with stash counters on them during our turn, Tiny Bones still gives us access to these spells even if he leaves and re-enters the battlefield. Then as some evasive attack-oriented discard sources to bring up the second half, we'll be slotting in Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, who offers us more on-attack discard, along with token creation as our opponents pitch lands and draw once they're hellbent, this time on an evasive life-linking body to more easily get in and pad our life totals with as he does so, and one who's extremely hard to permanently remove once our opponents are out of cards by letting us easily recur him from our land slot, and Rankle, Master of Pranks, who gives us another evasive body that can force AoE discard on damage this time, which does force us to discard as well, but not only is this optional, he can also do it as soon as he comes down thanks to his built-in haste, and he can also tack on an AoE draw and or edict for additional hand disruption, board clearing and or value if and when we need it. And wrapping up our enemy-focused discard with some non-legendary entries, we'll be running Bandit's Talent, a class that initially functions as a one-time enemy-only AoE discard source for more hand disruption, and that we can later level up to inflict additional damage to and to generate card advantage off of each opponent we reduce to 1 or fewer cards in hand to punish them for their lack of resources turn after turn. Siphon Mind, which not only rips more cards out of our opponent's hands, but also turns it into draw for ourselves as an on-theme source of card advantage, and Rixmati Dungeon Palace, another AoE discard source that may hit us and is limited to sorcery speed, but one that we can use from our land slot as a low commitment source of discard if we need to. Now, moving on to the suite of self-discard sources that we'll be using to proc our own discard payoffs and set up our bin for later, we'll be adding in Faithless Looting, Electric Revelation, and Laughing Mad, all of which provide discard-based card selection to help get cards into our bin while letting us dig for land drops and flicker sources in the early game for added consistency, and, thanks to their flashback, give us the option to play them from the bin if we pitch them to a discard effect or just want to get a second use out of them. Brass's Tunnel Grinder, which provides more looting to let us dig even deeper into our deck as it comes down, and, thanks to our abundance of permanents in this build, we can easily transform to grant us additional ramp and a free discover each turn for even more value. And lastly, Chainer Nightmare Adept, who offers us a repeatable source of discard that also lets us recur our creatures back from the bin, making him perfect in this build as a way to consistently get our ETB effects in and out of our graveyard, as well as, notably, granting all creatures we don't cast from hand haste, granting Kefka 2 procs the turn he comes down by letting him swing in immediately, and letting all the creatures we reanimate and or flicker swing in the turn they enter and re-enter play as well. And then to close out this category with a suite of discard-oriented payoffs that can take advantage of all the discard being done at the table. The first half brings us the self-discard payoffs, Containment Construct, and Conspiracy Theorist as ways for us to play and cast the cards we pitch respectively, the former allowing us to play our discarded lands for added flexibility, while the latter may be limited to spells, but is an on-attack loot effect itself to help us pitch and dig for more cards if the opportunity presents itself, along with Surly Badgesaur and Monument of Endurance as more ways for us to generate additional value as we pitch cards, the former growing itself and fighting creatures for repeatable removal, as well as ramping us with treasure tokens, and the latter providing us with more treasure-based ramp and draw for added value, along with more AoE burn to whittle down the table even faster, and Archfiend of Ifnir as an on-theme pseudo-board wipe, turning every card we pitch into AoE -1/-1 counter distribution to all our opponent's creatures, continually reducing their board presence down to nothing while Kefka rips any cards that could replace them out of their hands. Then switching gears in the second half to enemy-focused discard payoffs, we'll be running Geth's Grimoire as a way to turn each card our opponents discard into draw for ourselves to keep growing our hands as we diminish theirs, Waste Not as even more discard-focused value generation, which tacks on token creation and ramp alongside draw to widen the gap even further, and lastly, Quest for the Nilstone and Shrieking Affliction as a pair of repeatable burn sources, helping us further pile on the damage once our opponents are hellbent to close out the game even faster. So, now that we've gone over all the ways that we'll be emptying players' hands and generating value as we do so, let's move on to the ways we'll generate even more value from those same players' graveyards. Kicking things off with some graveyard-centric entries that allow us to steal our opponent's creatures for ourselves, we have Colstoke Gearhulk and Puppeteer Clique, both of which synergize very nicely with our flicker sources by allowing us to temporarily reanimate, then exile our opponent's creatures with haste as they ETB, the former being limited to CMC4 or less creatures, but giving us the option to hit our own creatures if needed, and granting the reanimated target menace and death touch to make it very unlikely to be blocked, and the latter hitting anything in our opponent's bin and having built-in persist to do so again if removed. Abyssal Harvester, which can instead create semi-permanent token copies of creatures by exiling the original on the turn they go into the bin, allowing us to capitalize on both our removal and discard to steal our opponent's creatures, and doing so again when the token gets destroyed or a better target becomes available. And lastly, Demon of Dark Schemes, which does admittedly take a bit to accumulate the energy it needs to use its reanimation, but once it's charged up, allows us to permanently reanimate any creature from any graveyard at instant speed for 3 mana a pop. And that's on top of the mini non-destruction wipe it provides as it comes down that we can make even better with our flicker sources, and it being a giant evasive beatstick as well. And then as our two final pieces of enemy resource theft, we'll be adding in Quistis Trap and Halo Forger, both of which allow us to cast instants and sorceries from either our or our opponent's graveyards as they ETB by functionally granting those spells flashback, again combining perfectly with our flicker sources to continually cast the best spells from any graveyard and ignoring their timing restrictions as a bonus. Then pivoting into generating value exclusively from our own graveyard instead, we'll be making space for the temporary token creating Felden of the Third Path, whose pseudo-blink-like effect for the creatures in our graveyard makes it yet another great way to make use of their ETB effects even if they aren't in play, the ETB reanimation source Phyrexian Delver, who is yet another excellent flicker target to cheat our discarded creatures back into play so long as we have the life to spare, the 2-for-1 reanimation spell Victimize, which works nicely with our temporary reanimation sources and token creation by letting us trade one of them to permanently reanimate 2 others from our bin, the repeatable creature recursion piece Oversold Cemetery, which takes advantage of our relatively large creature base and self-discard sources by repeatedly returning a creature from our grave to hand if there are 4 or more in it, giving us more cards to pitch to Kefka and or allowing us to slowly recover our creature base after a wipe or mass removal as needed, and the spell recursion piece Archaeomancer, which we'll be primarily using to return our instant speed flicker effects back to hand to further blink Kefka and our other creatures, but can easily get us extra uses out of any of our instants and sorceries as we need to. And finally, as our last 2 pieces of graveyard-oriented value, we have Strike It Rich, whose up to 2 pieces of treasure generation is superb at getting to Kefka faster in the early game, and which we can easily pitch to use later thanks to its built-in flashback, along with Anger, whose ability to grant all our creatures haste while it's in the bin is phenomenal in this build, giving Kefka another way to swing in the same turn he comes down for double the initial discard and value generation, and providing the same benefit to all our other on-attack and on-damage effect creatures to get their effects online even faster, doing all this from the relative safety of our graveyard. So, now that we've covered the graveyard portion of our game plan, let's move on to the remaining ETB-centric pieces we'll be running alongside Kefka to provide additional disruption and value as they and our other creatures enter and re-enter play. Starting off with a pair of ETB creatures who'll be helping speed up our mana generation, we have Solemn Simulacrum, whose ETB land ramp is already generically good but becomes fantastic here since we can easily reproc it, making it an excellent source of mana acceleration and fixing that can also occasionally draw us a card if we throw it in front of an attacker so we can recur and or reanimate it later, and a Plundering Barbarian, whose ETB treasure generation may only provide temporary ramp but is still good enough to get us to Kefka in the early game, while alternatively letting us use it as a piece of artifact removal for extra flexibility. And while on the topic of removal, we'll be adding in even more spot removal on bodies in the form of Big Game Hunter, whose ETB removal may be limited to 4+ power creatures, but it's madness for a single black pip, making it more than worth running since we can easily cast it when pitched through Kefka or any of our other self-discard sources. Urtai Resurrected, who can destroy any creature, though this time at the cost of giving its controller a card, which we'll usually be ripping out of their hands anyway, and even proccing our discard payoffs in the process, being able to do so at flash speed, and alternatively, letting us counter a spell or activated or triggered ability for even better disruption, and lastly, Tidecaller Mentor, Aether Channeler, and Venser Shaper Savant, all of whose permanent bouncing effects combine perfectly with Kefka and our other discard sources to get threats off the field and then into the bin. The first coming online very quickly thanks to all our self-discard sources, the second giving us the option to alternatively create evasive bodies or cantrip on ETB for extra flexibility, and the last allowing us to use him at flash speed from hand, letting us use him to remand spells back to hand to help protect our board and disrupt our opponent's plays, and, most diabolically, letting us bounce our opponent's lands if we want to take even more from them. And finally, as a pair of ETB doublers to round out this category, we have Panharmonicon and Naban Dean of Iteration, the former allowing us to get an extra proc out of all our ETB creatures to make them all twice as effective, and the latter, while being far more limited by affecting only our wizards, allowing us to get double the value out of Kefka at a dirt cheap cost, and similarly empowering the 7 other ETB effect wizards we're running for even more value. So, now that we've covered all the game plan specific cards in the build, let's wrap up this deck tech by going over the generic core stat pieces we'll be running as well as our land base. Starting off with our generic ramp pieces, we'll be running an enormous suite of rocks to help us get to Kefka as quickly as possible, those being the mandatory Soul Ring and Arcane Signet for their superb mana acceleration and fixing respectively, Felwar Stone for more cheap access to most of our colors off our opponent's lands, all 3 Talismans in our colors for more access to our colors when we need them and to colorless mana when we don't, and all 3 Signets in our colors for even more cheap access to color filtering and mana acceleration. And lastly, as we won't be running any generic draw or removal in this build, we have Blasphemous Act as our only generic board wipe, which allows us to clear the board of all creature-based threats for as little as a single mana if things start getting out of control, or alternatively, we can use it to remove the resources our opponents have in play once they're out of cards in hand, and then rebuild our board with our graveyard recursion pieces while they're left top decking for answers. Then quickly going over our mana lands, we have Command Tower and Crumbling Necropolis for easy access to all 3 of our colors, Exotic Orchard as more untapped access to colored mana off of our opponent's lands, all 3 check lands in our colors for more generally untapped access to our colors thanks to our decent number of basics, all 3 reveal lands in our colors for more of the same from our hand this time, and both battle lands in our colors for even more basic land supported untapped access to our colors for maximum speed. Then, for our utility lands, we'll be running Riptide Laboratory, which gives us a cheap way to self-bounce our wizards back to hand at instant speed, giving us a second way to protect Kefka from removal and wipes, or giving us the option to hardcast him if we don't have any flickers to reproc his effect, and a Demolition Field, which gives us the means to deal with any annoying utility lands our opponents throw our way, and, in a pinch, we can use it to fix our mana base so long as one of our opponents has a non-basic in play. And lastly, we'll be running 7 islands, 8 swamps, and 7 mountains as our basics to fill out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the contents of this deck, let's take a look at this build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 12 flicker/bounce effects, 15 creatures with ETB effects, and 3 cards that care about our creatures entering and leaving the battlefield in some capacity, giving us a solid flicker foundation that helps enable Kefka's AoE discard more often, provides alternative targets to blink once our opponents are hellbent, and allowing us to do so more often or to generate value while we do so, 15 sources of discard for either ourselves or our opponents, supplementing Kefka's discard to get our opponents hellbent faster while simultaneously allowing us to dig for more resources and filling up our bin, as well as 14 cards that care about a player discarding cards, and 19 cards that care about players' graveyards in some capacity, both providing us with the means to generate extra value as we rip cards out of our own and our opponents' hands to widen the gap between them and ourselves, either by generating us extra resources or by having them lose life at a faster rate. For general deck stats, our final build has 16 ramp sources, 9 draw sources, 10 removal sources, and 3 board wipes, our ramp being slightly higher than average to help us get to our CMC5 commander faster, our draw being slightly below average since we have repeatable access to it from the command zone and can generate value from our and our opponent's graveyards as well, and our removal, while being average on paper, is all repeatable when used in conjunction with our flicker and graveyard recursion pieces for even more board disruption. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.13, leaving us with a mid-weight curve on paper, but one that can be much faster in practice as we can pitch our high CMC cards into our bin to be recurred later, while simultaneously slowing down our opponents by ripping resources out of their hands. The total price of this deck then totals out to be $64.46, not counting the price of basic lands, taxes, or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace prices on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, for some side grade suggestions that don't increase this deck's budget too much, we can look into swapping Naban Dean of Iteration for the more discard-focused Raven Man if we want another discard source and discard payoff that can help build up our board over enabling Kefka and our other wizards, or alternatively, we can consider exchanging Halo Forger with the artifact recurring Archaeo Mender if we want to have the means to recur any of our pitched or destroyed artifacts at the cost of having less access to both our and our opponents' binned instants and sorceries. Then, if we want to further upgrade this deck by increasing the budget, we can bolster our Flicker package by swapping Siren's Ruse and Blur for the more repeatable Blink sources Displacer Kitten and Thassa Deep Dwelling, which either turn all our non-creature spells into Flicker sources or provide the build with another end-of-turn Flicker effect to get even more value out of our ETB creatures, refining our ETB creatures by cutting Phyrexian Delver and Electric Revelation in favor of the more removal-oriented Chaos Defiler and Shadowgrange Archfiend, which let us clear the board of troublesome permanents or the biggest creatures on each opponent's boards respectively to further starve them of resources, and or augmenting our discard payoffs by replacing Conspiracy Theorist with the better self-discard payoff, Bone Miser, which is literally a repackaged waste knot that procs when we discard cards, making it an excellent source of ramp, draw, and token bodies long after we've stripped our opponent's hands bare. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Lightning Army of One was able to claim the top spot after a landslide victory, so look forward to an increased budget damage amplification themed build featuring her coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, we'll be giving the multicolored commanders a rest in favor of some monocolored entrants, with this week's contenders being the Brooding Vessel of Chaos from Final Fantasy VII, Vincent Valentine, Cloud's childhood friend and arguably best girl from Final Fantasy VII, Tifa Lockhart, the legally distinct Street Rat from Final Fantasy XII, Von Street Thief, and a king with the two-headed coin from Final Fantasy VI, Edgar King of Figaro. So be sure to cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, before the deadline on July 11th, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And before we go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying product through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can keep making this content. And if you enjoy content like this, be sure to check out all my other deck techs either floating around my head or on the playlist above. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.